Undertale is hands down one of my favorite games. What started as a Kickstarter project funded in 2013 and released 2 years later became something of a phenomenon, capturing the imagination of many people. It's not a perfect game and not everybody will like it, but even if you hate the game and its sometimes overzealous fanbase, you can't deny the impact this game has had. Why did the game get so popular? Well, I think with its charming, unique personality, there's a lot to like about it. The soundtrack is fantastic. I've had Bone Trials on repeat for far too long. But I think most of all, what draws people in are the characters. So a small spoiler warning, I won't talk about the story, but I will talk about some of the mechanics that you'd otherwise learn as you go along, so if you wanted to play the game completely fresh, you've been warned. From the beginning of the Kickstarter, the main tagline of Undertale was that nobody has to die. For the most part, it's a typical RPG. If you explore, you get into trouble. But you also get a choice. You can kill the enemy and get the experience, or you can find a peaceful resolution. And this peaceful resolution boils down to psychological warfare. You get a menu of interactions that are specific for every enemy and character you encounter in the game. It's like a puzzle mechanic for characters, where you have to look at the character's design and what to say and do to figure out what the right action is, tying the mechanic directly to the individual. On top of this, you meet a bunch of major characters along the way that all have very strong personalities. But everybody, from the major characters to the random encounters, are very engaging. People grow to love these characters, sometimes to their surprise. I think Ross and Barry from Game Grumps illustrated this nicely. They were playing a genocide run where you basically have to kill everybody in the game, and they weren't having a good time.
How am I supposed to beat the game?
You know what?
This feels horrible.
Do you know what would be interesting? If you went to a prison full of the most heinous, horrible murderers.
Yes. People
and then
with
literally
no empathy.
No empathy. And literally made them play this. Literally for 2 weeks, as an experiment, said, you will get stuff, but you can only play Undertale for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
Beat it at least 3 times.
Ooh.
And then record the results with the inmates and see how many ruthless murderers actually did the genocide run, and how many of them felt empathy in this game.
Wow. That would be interesting, because this game makes you feel it.
But I feel like this game teaches you empathy if you don't have it.
So a couple of things to unpack there. First, he assumes that all murderers in prison have no empathy, or in other words, are all raging psychopaths, which isn't necessarily true. But more than that, he talks about feeling empathy towards these fictional characters, and I find that really interesting. Empathy is something we typically feel towards somebody else, so to feel empathy towards a fictional character in a video game is a pretty great achievement. This isn't the first media to invoke empathy in people, but it doesn't usually happen, and not across so many players. But what is empathy, and why is it important? And can Undertale really be used to teach somebody empathy? Is that even possible? Let's see what we can find out. First, we should make sure we're all on the same page with these terms. What is empathy? Empathy is a phenomenon where you understand another person's emotions and feelings and embody them. That last part is key. Empathy involves actually feeling what somebody else is feeling, being able to put yourself into their shoes and share their emotions. Say you're consoling a friend who's upset and you yourself start to feel upset. That phenomenon is empathy. Actually, we can do better with the definition. Empathy can be said to occur when you're feeling the same emotional state as somebody else. Your change in state must have been elicited by observing or imagining their change in state, and you must be aware that they are the source of your change in state. This is fundamentally different from sympathy. Sympathy is only understanding somebody else's position. You can see where they're coming from. You can even feel pity for them, but you aren't embodying their emotions. People often meld these two terms together, but they really are quite different. Sympathy is understanding, empathy is embodying. Got it memorized? Okay, but we can go further with this. We know from neuroimaging studies that there are overlapping brain activations when people empathize with others versus experiencing the same emotions in themselves. The same neural areas are activated. Some key areas involved in processing empathy are the anterior cingulate cortex, amygdala, hypothalamus, anterior insula, and the orbitofrontal cortex. So it's a pretty wide network, but it's definitely emotion related. But there has been some debate as to what controls empathy. When do we experience empathy and when do we not? A lot of people think that empathy is a completely automatic and uncontrollable process. It's something that just happens. You can't help it. There is, however, some evidence that suggests that empathy might be modulated in some way, like how people show a lower empathetic response when witnessing pain in somebody else, when that pain is justified as to be for their own good or to cure them. Another study found that males stopped showing an empathetic response to people when they were deemed unfair. In fact, when these unfair people were punished, reward circuits were activated. So bottom line is, context is important for empathy. So we've got the how and the when of empathy down, but we're still missing the why. And answering this will be a little bit more tricky. We don't really know. I think the best angle to look at this problem is through an evolutionary perspective. Empathy must be some adaptive feature we evolved since we have it, so why do we do it? Consider one of the major things that makes us humans pretty unique from other animals. Community. We've been banding together and forming societies for a huge chunk of our existence. We're not the only species that form communities, but I think humans take it to a greater extent than we observe in other species. We lived as groups, we hunted as groups, and we foraged as groups. We formed intricate communication systems to better coordinate and come together. And why? Because it's helped our survival. Hell, I'd argue that if we hadn't evolved the drive to come together as groups so early on, we wouldn't be here. It's one of the major factors that helped us be so successful as a species. Relatively. This is an example of an adaptation. It's a feature that we evolved through natural selection that increased our fitness. Not our physical fitness or even the personal survival of the individual, but fitness as the ability to propagate your genes and for the species to survive. See, when you're an evolutionary psychologist, there's one question you should be asking. How does this attribute help propagate my genes? It's all about fitness. And so we have this adaptive trait in humans, this societal feature that's like a super booster for fitness. Natural selection is obviously going to choose whatever helps go in that direction. So empathy might just be a chosen feature. Empathy promotes connection between individuals at a very fundamental level. You're essentially simulating what's going on in somebody else's brain. It's like mind reading. And this helps individuals in a species to come together, to form groups and connect with one another. It also helps to interpret other people's actions and predict their reactions, meaning you can better communicate and adapt to one another. As Dr. Franz de Waal put it, empathy allows one to quickly and automatically relate to the emotional states of others, which is essential for the regulation of social interaction, coordinated activity, and cooperation towards shared goals. It's probably a pretty ancient feature, and it might even predate language, but we don't really know. I should note that there is some opposition for this idea of empathy as a force for good. Dr. Paul Bloom has a book out called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion, where he argues that empathy actually leads to poor moral decisions, negative outcomes in behavior, and even cruelty. That having high empathy says nothing about you being a good person, since empathy disregards the nature of the outcome. But regardless of all this, I think you can agree how awesome it is that we're capable of empathizing with these fictional characters in a video game. It really says a lot about how well constructed the characters in Undertale are and how much work went into constructing them and the story. I mean, we have this system that is meant to try to embody the emotions of other people in yourself, that has evidence that when you empathize with other people, you're essentially simulating their brain state in your own brain. And here you have this unassuming pixel art retro-like game with only text or dialogue, huge restrictions on character appearance, with only minor facial expressions in the text box, and yet we feel an empathetic response to this. I find this amazing. Of course, this hasn't quite gotten at Ross's original idea. Can this game be used to teach empathy? In some cases, maybe. If somebody already has a capacity for empathy, a game like Undertale could help practice empathy, and that might increase that capacity. I've actually seen studies that tried empathy classes for prisoners that have been successful in some people. But there's one caveat to keep in mind with what I just said. They have to already have the capacity for empathy. See, like everything, there is variation. There are outliers. And while some people might have a higher empathetic response for other people and be particularly sensitive, there are some out there that have no empathy whatsoever. I think we've talked enough about this for now, but sometime in the future, we're going to finish this discussion and we're going to talk about psychopaths.